Hey folks, welcome to the Challenging Concepts video for monetary and fiscal policy. So, what I think makes monetary and fiscal policy challenging is tying it back to the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, which helps determine our nation's three major macroeconomic variables: the price level in the economy, the real GDP rate, which is represented by the variable Y, and the unemployment rate, represented by the variable U. So, just as a little bit of a recap, our nation's price level P, real GDP Y, and unemployment rate U are all determined as a result of something called a long run equilibrium, which is what we get when we combine our nation's demand for GDP, called aggregate demand, with our nation's supply of GDP, called aggregate supply, hence the name of the model. And there are actually two different ways to think about supply. There is supply in the short run, which we call short run aggregate supply, or short run, or SRAS, represented by this upward sloping line. And then there is supply in the long run, represented by this long run aggregate supply curve, or LRAS, which is vertical at a point on our real GDP axis called Y star, which is called our potential GDP. It's the healthy, happy level of GDP in our economy when we're not in an expansion or a contraction of the business cycle. We're kind of just at this happy medium. So this is where any problem with our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model will start. And then monetary and fiscal policy can respond to certain macroeconomic fluctuations that can cause that GDP, unemployment, and price level to fluctuate. Another thing I want to remind you of is aggregate demand. That's demand for our nation's goods and services. It is made up of four groups of people who demand goods and services. There are the consumers, represented by C, consumption. There are businesses who need goods and services. They are represented by this I, called investment. Our government, both state and local as well as federal governments, need goods and services. They are the G component of aggregate demand. And then what other countries demand of our goods and services here in the United States is represented by this NX. It stands for net exports. So if we add together the demand from consumers, businesses, governments, and other countries, we get demand for all goods and services in our economy. So let's first start by thinking about monetary policy and how the Fed could use monetary policy to respond to a recession. So a recession means that there is a decline in GDP, people are losing their jobs, things aren't going so well. And we learned in this module that when there is a contraction in the business cycle, or a severe enough contraction that we might call it a recession, the Fed can respond by using expansionary monetary policy. Expansionary monetary policy means increasing our nation's money supply and lowering interest rates. And when that happens, the Fed will typically use their primary monetary policy tool called open market operations, or OMOs, and buy bonds from the banks. They will buy bonds with brand new cash, hand that cash to the banks. The banks are going to use that money to make loans to other people. So when the bank is lending out money, and through that multiplier process, we're going to see new money created in the economy, our money supply increases, which boosts the I component of aggregate demand. When there's all this new money from the Fed, we also see interest rates in the economy fall to encourage new borrowing. Maybe businesses take out more loans, expand, scale up their businesses, and all this together increases our aggregate demand. Remember that I, investment component of aggregate demand, is going to increase. And so it's going to shift to the right in this graph. So if we look at what just happened visually, when aggregate demand shifts to the right, we go from this initial equilibrium point that I've labeled E1 here in the graph, and a starting price level of P1, and a starting GDP level of Y star, and a starting unemployment rate of U, to this equilibrium point up and to the right. It's where my new rightward shifted aggregate demand curve, AD2, crosses short run aggregate supply. And at this point, we can see that we're going to have a little bit of a higher price level. The price level in the economy is going to increase. We might get some inflation as prices are rising because of all this new money circulating in the economy. But we're also going to get a higher level of GDP. The Y variable, which represents our real GDP, is out to the right along this Y-axis at a higher level. And that higher level of GDP, when we're producing more goods and services, is going to lower our unemployment rate, represented by the variable lowercase u, so that it's actually lower than our unemployment rate. So the Fed can successfully boost our economy, increasing our real GDP and reducing unemployment, creating some new jobs through this expansionary monetary policy. However, this right here is just a short run equilibrium point. To see what happens in the long run, we need to see where this aggregate demand curve crosses long run supply, which is what I have here on this new slide. And at that point at the top, here I have it marked as point C, we can see that the price level has gone up again. We've created some new inflation in the economy, a higher overall price level. But if you look at what happens to the Y, the real GDP variable, and the U, the unemployment variable, they kind of go back in line with the original point we started at Y star and U star. And so there's effectively no change in the long run. GDP was up, but it's going to decrease back down to its original level. Unemployment was down less than U star, but it's going to increase back to being equal to the natural rate. So there's effectively no change long term. Sometimes this is called monetary neutrality, the idea that monetary policy can only have short run effects and that those effects kind of wear off in the long run, except for when it comes to the price level. And so the Fed is pretty powerless overall to influence the economy long term. Now, how could Congress and the president respond to a recession? Well, they could also use expansionary policy, but they're going to focus on fiscal policy, government spending and taxes, to stimulate the economy. Now, if they wanted to stimulate the economy, they might pass legislation called, say, a stimulus bill, which would maybe be a combination of raising government spending. They could spend more money on the military. They could build new roads, new dams, new schools. That's going to boost the G, government spending component of aggregate demand. And they could also lower taxes. They could do that by reducing tax rates, or sometimes what they like to do is they actually like to pay back tax money people have already paid in the form of stimulus checks. If you've heard that term before, it's like going back in time and lowering taxes to give consumers, the C component of aggregate demand, more money in their pockets to spend, less money they're paying in taxes. But both of these have the same effect. It's going to increase aggregate demand, shift it to the right, and we're going to get a lot of that same short run effect that we did with expansionary monetary policy. We're going to get this boost to real GDP, we're going to get this lower unemployment, and also a little bit of pressure upwards on the price level in the economy as people are spending more money. And in the long run, those effects are going to wear off when it comes to our GDP and unemployment, but we will have some permanent higher price levels as a result. Now, there is some type of fiscal policy called supply side fiscal policy that actually targets shifting the long run aggregate supply curve by looking at things like investing in long-term education or research and development to try and spur some new technology changes. But in terms of counter-cyclical policy, most of the policies we see these days are focused on boosting aggregate demand and creating these long-run effects. Now, let's talk about what contractionary policy would look like when it comes to the Fed and their monetary policy, or Congress and the president and their contractionary fiscal policy. So if the Fed was worried about inflation, they might do the opposite of what they did in the recession situation. They might take action to reduce our nation's money supply and raise interest rates. Again, they can use those OMOs, those open market operations, where they buy and sell bonds, but this time they will actually sell the bonds to the banks and make the banks pay them with their money. When the banks give their money to the Fed, the banks have less money themselves to lend out, and that is going to decrease our nation's money supply. And when there's a decrease in our nation's money supply, interest rates rise. The money that is left for the banks to lend out after they have purchased these bonds from the Fed is going to be very expensive to borrow, and that's going to decline the investment component of aggregate demand and actually shift aggregate demand to the left this time, a decrease like this. And so we'll move from this initial equilibrium point E1 to this down and to the left equilibrium point of E2 on this new aggregate demand curve, AD2, after that decrease to the left. And we can see that the results of this contractionary monetary policy will be lower prices, but we're also going to see a lower level of real GDP. The Y variable is closer to this origin point on the graph. And when GDP is below our potential GDP, represented by this Y star, we're actually going to see a rise in unemployment, such that the unemployment rate will be greater than the natural rate, signaling that there might be some cyclical unemployment occurring, and that if the Fed isn't careful, they could actually push the economy into a recession if this decline in GDP and increase in unemployment was severe enough. That being said, the long run equilibrium point on this graph, which is where my new leftward aggregate demand curve is going to cross the long run aggregate supply curve right here, is going to create the results we wanted. We're going to have, in the long run, the only thing permanently changed is going to be the price level. It's going to be lower at P3 here. And the GDP and unemployment is going to go back in line where we started at Y star in the natural rate, such that there's no change in the long run. And that is how the Fed can control for prices getting a little too high when inflation is going crazy in the economy. Now, Congress and the president can also do these contractionary actions. Now, a lot of times their goal is not focused on necessarily reducing inflation, but maybe if some concerns arise about the federal budget and they want to reduce our annual deficits, maybe chip away at the national debt, they might use contractionary fiscal policy. So Congress and the president could pass some different bills, or their annual budget can be a little bit more balanced to decrease government spending while raising taxes, trying to bring in maybe even a budget surplus. That reduced government spending is going to decline the G component of aggregate demand. Raising taxes means that consumers will have less money after they pay those taxes to spend for themselves, so that reduces consumption. And both of these actions together are going to reduce aggregate demand by targeting those consumption and government spending components. And so it's going to shift to the left as well. So in the short run, this decline in government spending and increase in taxes can create some lower prices, lower GDP, and higher unemployment. It can create potentially a bit of recession if they do too much too quickly. But in the long run, there's going to be a long run equilibrium point right here, E3, where we get a lower price level, no change to GDP, and no change to unemployment. But Congress and the president want to be careful. They're lowering GDP and raising unemployment. They tend to do this during expansions in the business cycle, or the theory is that they would do this during expansions in the business cycle, so that when the economy is already heating up, they can take some action to pay down the debts and deficits during that time, so that that decline in GDP and raise in unemployment on net doesn't have a negative impact on Americans in their everyday economic lives. I hope that helps explain monetary and fiscal policy and how it ties back to our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model.